She told the dying that their pain was a gift from God. Then she flew to California to make sure she never had to feel it. That is not a metaphor. That is not an interpretation. That is the documented, verifiable, on-the-record biography of the most celebrated humanitarian in modern history. The woman the Vatican fast-tracked to sainthood, whose name became a global synonym for selfless compassion, whose smile appeared on the covers of magazines in over 100 countries for 3 decades. The smile, in her own private words, was a mask. She wrote that in a letter she asked to be burned. It wasn't burned. And what survived the fire is not the story you were taught in school. It is not the story that aired on 1,000 documentaries. It is not the story that moved a global audience to donate hundreds of millions of dollars to an organization that, to this day, has never submitted to an independent financial audit. It is something older and darker and far more instructive, because this is not really a story about one woman's contradictions. It is a story about what we are willing not to see. When the person standing in front of us is wearing the right clothes, saying the right words, and giving us a reason to feel good about ourselves for believing them. Mother Teresa gave the world that reason for 50 years. The world never looked behind it. Until now. In 1994, a British physician named Robin Fox traveled to Calcutta. He wasn't a journalist. He wasn't an activist with an agenda. He was the editor of The Lancet, one of the most prestigious and rigorously peer-reviewed medical journals in the world. He went to see Mother Teresa's most famous institution firsthand, Nirmal Hriday, the home for the dying. The place she had built specifically to shelter the sick, the destitute, the forgotten. The place the world had donated hundreds of millions of dollars to support. The place that had become, in the public imagination, the physical embodiment of human compassion. What he found inside did not match the brochure. Fox documented patients lying in rows on basic cots, receiving little to no pain management for terminal conditions. Men and women dying of cancer, tuberculosis, and advanced infections, lying in silence, without analgesics, without palliative care, without the basic pharmaceutical interventions that any mid-tier hospital in the developed world would have considered.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
Non-negotiable. Needles, he noted, were rinsed and reused between patients, rather than properly sterilized. Volunteers with no medical training were making decisions that, anywhere else, would have required a licensed physician. Diagnostic equipment was scarce. Basic triage protocols were absent. He published his findings in The Lancet later that year. The article did not cause a scandal. It barely caused a ripple. The world, it turned out, was not ready to look too closely at a living saint. But here is where the record starts to crack. Here is the detail that sits quietly in the historical file, waiting for someone to stop and read it properly. While the patients inside her facilities lay on cots without adequate pain relief, while they endured the final stages of illness without the basic comfort that modern medicine could have provided, Mother Teresa herself, when she became seriously ill, did not go to Nirmal Hriday. She went to California. When she suffered cardiac episodes in the late 1980s and early 1990s, she was treated at the Scripps Clinic in La Jolla, a world-class medical facility equipped with the most advanced cardiac care available anywhere on the planet. She received angioplasty. She received the full spectrum of interventions that modern medicine could offer. She was surrounded by specialists. She recovered, and then she returned to Calcutta, where the dying continued to receive reused needles and no morphine. This is not an allegation. It is not a theory constructed from speculation. It is documented. It is on the record. And it raises a question so simple, so obvious, that the fact it was almost never asked publicly for decades tells you something profound about how moral authority works, and how completely it can blind us. If suffering was redemptive, if pain brought the dying closer to God, as Teresa reportedly told patients inside her homes, then why, when it was her turn to suffer, did she choose the Scripps Clinic? Why did she choose angioplasty over grace? The answer, when it finally started surfacing in academic literature and investigative journalism, would reframe everything the world thought it knew about the most celebrated humanitarian of the 20th century. But that answer didn't come quickly. It came in layers. And the first layer looks exactly like the story you already know. But history has a way of leaving behind traces. Traces that don't fit the story we were told. She was born Agnese Gonje Bojaciu in August 1910 in a small town in what is now North Macedonia. The daughter of an Albanian grocer, she was by all accounts a quiet, devout child, the kind of girl who stayed after Mass to help arrange flowers on the altar. At 18, she left home to join the Sisters of Loreto, an Irish missionary order operating in India. She would never see her mother again. She arrived in Calcutta in 1929, began teaching at a convent school, and by most measures lived an ordinary life of quiet religious service for nearly 2 decades. Then, on September 10, 1946, something changed. She was on a train to Darjeeling when she described receiving what she called a call within a call, a direct instruction from God to leave the convent, go into the slums, and serve the poorest of the poor. She obeyed. She traded her convent habit for a white cotton sari with blue trim, walked out into the streets of Calcutta, and began working with the destitute, the dying, and the abandoned. The world had seen missionaries before. It had not seen anything quite like this. By 1950, the Vatican had formally recognized her new congregation, the Missionaries of Charity. By 1965, it had expanded internationally. By the 1970s, she was appearing on the covers of international magazines. Malcolm Muggeridge, the prominent British journalist, filmed a BBC documentary about her work in 1969 called Something Beautiful for God. It aired to enormous audiences across Europe and North America. Muggeridge, who would later convert to Catholicism, credited Teresa herself as a catalyst. The documentary made her a global figure almost overnight. The Nobel Peace Prize followed in 1979. In her acceptance speech in Oslo, she spoke not of logistics or policy or systemic poverty relief. She spoke of love, of the individual, of looking into the eyes of one dying person and seeing Christ. The speech was translated into dozens of languages. It was taught in schools. It became one of the defining moral documents of the late 20th century. By the time she died in 1997, she had become something that very few human beings in history have ever become: a living symbol. Not just of charity, but of goodness itself. Of the idea that one person, armed with nothing but faith and will, could walk into the darkest corner of the world and make it light. School children across the world drew portraits of her. Governments issued stamps bearing her image. Pope John Paul II fast-tracked her beatification, a process that normally takes decades, initiating it just 2 years after her death. She was canonized as Saint Teresa of Calcutta in 2016, before a crowd of over 100,000 people in St. Peter's Square. The story was airtight. A poor girl from the Balkans hears the voice of God on a train, walks into the slums of Calcutta, and spends the next 50 years proving that selfless love is the most powerful force in human history. It is a beautiful story. It is the kind of story that makes people donate, that makes governments look away, that makes journalists hesitate before asking the next question. And for most of the 20th century, almost no one asked the next question. Almost. If you look at the surface, it makes sense. But the moment you scratch that surface, the whole thing starts to bleed. In 2013, a team of researchers at the University of Montreal published a study in a peer-reviewed academic journal called Studies in Religion. They were not tabloid journalists. They were not anti-religion activists. They were academics, methodical, sourced, careful with language. And what they produced was not an opinion piece. It was a systematic review of the existing literature on Mother Teresa's work, her organization, and the gap between her public image and the documented record. The title of the study was precise and deliberately understated. The Missionary Position, Mother Teresa in Theory and Practice. The findings were not. The researchers identified 3 core problems that appeared consistently across independent sources spanning decades. First, the medical care provided inside missionaries of charity facilities was substandard in ways that could not be explained by lack of funding. Second, the financial accounts of the organization were almost entirely opaque. Donations poured in from across the world, and almost none of it could be traced to direct improvements in patient care or infrastructure. Third, Teresa maintained close personal and financial relationships with a series of deeply controversial figures, relationships that received almost no scrutiny during her lifetime, because the moral armor she wore was simply too thick to penetrate. Each of these findings had been noted in isolation by journalists and physicians over the years. What the Montreal study did was put them in the same room. And when you put them in the same room, the picture that emerges is not of an overwhelmed charity struggling with limited resources. It is of an institution that, at its core, was not primarily organized around the relief of suffering. It was organized around something else entirely. The BBC had already begun pulling at this thread years earlier. In 1994, the same year Robin Fox published his Lancet assessment, journalist Tariq Ali and filmmaker Christopher Hitchens produced a documentary for Channel 4 titled Hell's Angel. It aired in Britain to significant controversy. In it, they presented testimony from doctors and nurses who had worked inside Teresa's facilities, volunteers who had arrived expecting modern charitable operations and found something far more troubling, and financial analysts who had attempted to trace the flow of donations into the missionaries of charity's accounts. What they could not find was where the money went. The missionaries of charity was, by the 1990s, receiving an estimated $50 million per year in donations. Some estimates place the cumulative total received over decades in the hundreds of millions. The organization operated in over 100 countries. And yet, the facilities remained basic. The staff remained undertrained. The medical supplies remained inadequate. Christopher Hitchens, in his 1995 book on Teresa, put the question with characteristic bluntness. He asked, in essence, if the money is not going to the patients, where is it going? No satisfactory answer was ever provided by the missionaries of charity. No independent audit was ever permitted, and the world, still looking at the white sari and the blue trim, still hearing the echo of the Oslo speech, did not press the question. But the question did not go away, because by now, a second thread had been pulled, and this one did not lead to a financial ledger. It led to something far more personal. It led to what Teresa herself had written, in private, over 5 decades. Letters she had explicitly asked to be destroyed after her death. They were not destroyed. We aren't just looking at a mistake anymore. We are looking at a pattern. In 2007, a book was published that should have rewritten the public understanding of Mother Teresa permanently. It was called Come Be My Light. It was not written by a critic. It was not a...
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
assembled by an investigative journalist or an academic with an agenda. It was compiled by a Catholic priest named Brian Kolodaichuk, who was himself the postulator of Teresa's canonization cause, the man whose job it was to build the case for her sainthood. He had gathered her private correspondence over decades, letters written to her confessors and spiritual directors, letters she had explicitly, repeatedly requested be destroyed after her death. The Church did not destroy them. It published them. And what those letters contained was not the voice of a woman radiant with divine love. It was the voice of a woman in profound, sustained, private agony. For nearly 50 years, almost the entirety of her public ministry, Teresa wrote that she felt nothing, that when she prayed, there was silence, that God felt absent, that the faith she performed in public, the certainty she projected from every podium and every photograph, bore almost no resemblance to what she experienced internally. In one letter she wrote to her confessor, she described her interior state as darkness. In another, she compared herself to hell. In one of the most striking passages, published and reported on by CNN at the time of the book's release, she wrote that the smile she wore, the smile the world had come to associate with living sainthood, was, in her own words, a mask. A mask. Not a metaphor, not humility. Her word. Her description of her own public performance. The letters did not exist in isolation. They connected directly to the pattern the Montreal researchers had identified, and to the financial opacity that Hitchens and the BBC had documented. Because once you understand that Teresa's internal experience was one of radical doubt, once you accept that the woman performing certainty on the world stage was privately consumed by emptiness, a darker question emerges about the philosophy that governed her institutions. Teresa famously spoke of suffering as a gift. She told the dying in her care that their pain brought them closer to Christ. She described their condition, publicly and repeatedly, as something beautiful, a participation in the passion of Jesus. But the letters reveal that she herself was suffering, privately, silently, for decades. And she did not describe her own suffering as a gift. She described it as abandonment. This is the fracture at the center of everything. The woman who told the dying that pain was redemptive was not living that theology in private. She was fleeing it, to Scripps Clinic in La Jolla, to the best cardiologists in Rome, to every available medical intervention that money and institutional power could provide. The BBC's coverage of the canonization process in 2016 noted, almost in passing, that none of this contradiction had been formally addressed by the Vatican during the sainthood proceedings. The letters were acknowledged. The doubt was reframed as a spiritual trial, as evidence of heroic virtue rather than evidence of a performance sustained across 5 decades. The Church took the mask and called it a crown. And this is where it becomes something else entirely. Because the dying did not know. The men and women who lay on those cots in Nirmal-Rede, who endured pain without morphine, who were told that their suffering was sacred, who placed their trust in the woman in the white sari. They did not know that the woman delivering that theology did not believe it for herself. They did not know she was in the dark too. They did not know she called it hell. They did not know the smile was a mask. They died. Inside institutions funded by hundreds of millions of dollars in global donations that no independent auditor was ever permitted to examine. Comforted by a theology its own author had privately abandoned. Cared for by an organization whose founder, when her own body failed, chose California over Calcutta. Every single time. This is not a story about doubt. Doubt is human. Doubt is forgivable. This is a story about what was built on top of that doubt, and who paid the price for it. This isn't history. It's a warning. Mother Teresa was canonized on September 4, 2016. The ceremony in St. Peter's Square drew over 100,000 people. Flags from dozens of countries. Television cameras from every major network. A pope who spoke of her as a symbol of mercy for the modern world. It was, by every external measure, a triumph of institutional narrative. A story that had survived journalists, physicians, academics, and a published collection of its own protagonists' private doubts, and emerged not just intact, but elevated. She was now, officially, a saint. And that canonization tells us something important. Not about Teresa, about us. Because the evidence was not hidden. That is the part that is easy to miss, and the part that matters most. Robin Fox published his Lancet findings in 1994. The Channel 4 documentary aired the same year. Hitchens published his book in 1995. The Montreal study came out in 2013. The private letters were published in 2007 by the Catholic Church itself. None of this was buried in classified archives or suppressed by powerful institutions. It was available. It was public. It was findable by anyone with a library card or an internet connection. And it changed almost nothing. The donations continued. The canonization proceeded. The image held. This is what happens when moral authority reaches a certain altitude. It stops being evaluated and starts being assumed. The goodness becomes structural, built into the way we talk about the person, the way we teach their story in schools, the way we use their name as a benchmark. "She's no Mother Teresa" is still a phrase people use to describe someone falling short of selfless compassion. The name became a unit of measurement, and units of measurement don't get audited. This matters in 2026 in ways that are concrete and immediate. We live in a world awash with charitable branding, foundations attached to the names of billionaires, NGOs operating in crisis zones with minimal transparency, influencers running fundraising campaigns with no independent verification of where the money goes. The architecture is different. The mechanism is identical. We donate to the image. We donate to the feeling the image produces in us, the warmth, the moral participation, the sense that by giving, we are touching something genuinely good. And once that feeling is established, once the brand is strong enough, the actual operations become almost irrelevant. Because to question the operations is to question the feeling. And questioning the feeling is uncomfortable. Teresa understood this. Consciously or not, she embodied it. The white sari was not incidental. The deliberate poverty of her personal presentation, no jewelry, no comfort, no visible concession to material ease, was a constant visual argument. It said, "This woman has nothing to gain." And when a person appears to have nothing to gain, we stop asking what they might be protecting. What the record shows she was protecting was an institution with hundreds of millions of dollars in unaudited donations, operating in over 100 countries, accountable to no external authority, governed entirely by an internal hierarchy answerable only to Rome. An institution that, to this day, has never published a full financial accounting. The Missionaries of Charity still operates. It still receives donations. It still carries the weight of her name and the authority of her canonization as its primary credential. And it still does not open its books. The BBC noted in its 2016 coverage of the canonization that requests for financial transparency from the organization had gone unanswered for years. Journalists who attempted to gain access to internal operations reported significant institutional resistance. The story was the same as it had always been. The image was the product. The image was also the shield. And we, collectively, built both. Every documentary that aired without a follow-up question. Every school curriculum that presented her story as settled. Every donation made on the strength of a name rather than an audit. Every journalist who hesitated at the edge of the story and pulled back because the target was too beloved, the blowback too certain, the moral cost of being wrong too high. We did not just believe the story, we enforced it. And the people who paid the highest price for our credulity were the ones who had no other options. The ones who ended up on those cots, the ones who needed more than a theology of suffering. They needed medicine. The next time you hear the official version of a story, ask yourself, who is holding the pen? There is a version of this story that ends with an indictment that frames Teresa as a fraud, a cynical operator who built an empire on the suffering of the poor while the world applauded. That reduces her to the sum of her contradictions and calls it a verdict. That version is too easy. And easy verdicts are exactly the problem we started with. The truth, as the record shows it, is more uncomfortable than a simple indictment. Because Teresa was not a cartoon villain. She was a woman who experienced something real on that train to Darjeeling in 1946. Something that reorganized her entire life, that drove her into the slums of Calcutta when she could have stayed safely inside the convent walls. The letters that reveal her private darkness also reveal her private discipline. She showed up every day for 50 years, in conditions that would have broken most people in a week. That is not nothing. But here is what it also is. It is not sufficient justification for what was built around her. Because what was built around her, the institutional opacity, the unaudited hundreds of millions, the medical negligence dressed as theology, the relationships with dictators and fraudsters that her moral armor made untouchable. That was not the inevitable consequence of one woman's faith. That was a choice. A series of choices made by an institution, protected by a narrative, and enabled by a world that had decided, collectively, that some figures are too important to scrutinize. This is the pattern that outlives her. This is what the story of Mother Teresa actually teaches us, if we are willing to learn it. Moral authority is not evidence of moral conduct. The strength of an image is not proof of the integrity of what it represents. And the more universally beloved a figure becomes, the more their name functions as a synonym for goodness itself, the more urgently their actual record demands examination. Not because goodness doesn't exist, because goodness, real goodness, does not require the lights to stay off. It does not ask you to skip the audit. It does not need the letters destroyed. We are living through an era that is building new saints in real time. Not religious ones, but the mechanism is identical. Figures whose moral authority has reached the altitude where questioning them feels like an act of cruelty, whose foundations and organizations and institutions operate behind the shield of their image, collecting money and influence and power, while the actual work remains conveniently unverifiable. We have not learned to ask the next question. We have only changed the faces on the wall. Teresa spent 50 years in private darkness, performing certainty for a world that needed to believe. That is a tragedy, a genuine one. But the greater tragedy is what we built on top of her performance. The systems we refused to examine. The questions we refused to ask. The people we left on cots because we were too moved by the story to look at the room. History does not repeat because the villains are clever. It repeats because the rest of us find the official version more comfortable than the truth. So here is the question I want to leave with you. Not about Teresa, about the stories you are currently inside of. The figures you have decided in advance not to question. The institutions you support on the strength of a name rather than an account. The images you have accepted as proof. Who told you that story? And what were they protecting when they did? Leave your answer in the comments, because this conversation does not end here. It ends when enough people start asking the question before the canonization, not after. Next week, we uncover the hidden machinery behind the world's most celebrated act of mercy, and the empire that was quietly built in its name while nobody was watching. The white sari was just the beginning.